This video is about adding and subtracting rational numbers, specifically decimals. So let's do a quick review from 5th grade when we were talking about adding and subtracting decimals. We'll add in the 7th grade twist afterwards. So when we add or subtract decimals, it is very important that you line up the decimals. And this is what I mean by that. Here I have three numbers. I have 1 and 3/10, 25 hundredths, and the number 5. You can see visually these numbers with the decimals here if I was to line them up. This is 1 whole and 3/10, no holes in 25 hundredths. Here's 5 wholes. So this 5 would go in front because all the whole numbers are in front of the decimals, all the fractions are behind. Second thing is when you're adding, you're going to carry to the next column. So what do we mean by that? If you had something like 23 and 18, and I was adding these two numbers together, 8 plus 3 is 11, and I'm going to carry 1 or that 10 over. So then I'm going to have more going on and continuing along. We're going to be carrying 10s into the next column. When we do subtraction, we may borrow 10 from the next column to complete the action of borrowing. So if I had, let's say, 35 and I wanted to subtract 18 from that. Now, if there's 5, we have to deal with everything singly, right? So when I'm borrowing this 8, there's only 5 and I want 8. So I'm going to have to come over to that 10 here and take away a 10 and add it over here. So now this becomes 15. It's no longer 5, it's 15. Now I can do 15 take away 8, which is 7. And now that's 2 10s here and 1 10 here. 2 take away 1 is 1. So this is when we're borrowing from that next column to complete that subtraction activity. So let's practice that a little bit here. So here we're going to line up the decimals. I have 4 and 218 thousandths and 5 and 83 hundredths. I'm going to add those two numbers together. When there is a space missing on the place value, we're going to add a 0 so that it kind of helps to line it up. You don't have to do that, but it helps. So 8 plus 0 is 8. That's 4. Here we're going to have 8 plus 2, which is 10, which we're going to carry the 10 to the next column. We have 9 plus 1, which is 10 again, and that gives us this number here, which is 10 and 48 thousandths. We're going to do it again with this number here. Here I have the whole number 5, and remember that decimal's in right behind that whole number of 5 because there is no other part to it. That's all there is. So we're going to add these two numbers together. You can see that the fractional part is just going to stay, or that decimal part, and 5 plus 4 is 9. So we end up with 9 and 38 thousandths. Let's take a look really quick here at a subtraction problem. Here I have 3 and 25 hundredths, and I'm going to subtract 1 and 8 tenths. Once again, like I said, we're going to add a 0 in that empty place value just so that we can keep things straight. 5 take away 0 is 5. I can't take 8 from 2, so I need to borrow next door from that 3. I need to borrow a 10 from that and bring it over. So this is no longer 2, it is now it is 12. So 12 take away 8 is 4. Bring my decimal down. 2 take away 1 is 1. So I end up with 1 and 45 hundredths. So that's just a quick review of adding and subtracting from 5th grade. So now let's talk about 7th grade. What's the twist that we add when we go into 7th grade? Well, that twist is that we're going to talk about positive numbers and negative numbers. So let's review our rules for when we have the same sign. So if I'm adding and the signs are the same, so if I have 2 positives and 2 more positives, what happens? So in other words, if I have positive 2 and positive 2, well, that equals to positive 4, right? Nothing happens, sign stays the same. So I'm just going to add together and keep the sign. The same is true for negatives. So if I had 2 negatives and 2 more negatives, right? Here, basically what's happening is I have a negative 2 and a negative 2. Altogether, I have negative 4. So reminding ourselves that when we have the same sign and we're adding, we're just going to keep the sign and we're just going to add those numbers together. So let's remind ourselves about different signs. So let's say I had a positive 2 and a negative 4. So we can see that those are indeed opposite signs. So let me take 2 positives, so 2 greens, And let me get 4 negatives out here. So this is what we have, and we remember from our integer work that every time we have a positive and negative, this is a zero pair. This is a zero pair. So since these zero pairs go away, we are just left with 2 negatives, and that's why a positive 2 and a negative 4 yield a negative 2. So we remember that when we have different signs, we take the difference of the numbers. In other words, we subtract the numbers and keep the sign of the number that has the largest absolute value, the largest distance from 0. We're going to keep that sign. So we got to remember that about adding. So what do we remember about subtracting rules? Well, hopefully you remember that we're just going to change that subtraction problem into an addition problem. And once it turns into an addition problem, then it's easier to solve, right? Because we're going to do that by turning it into addition problem and taking the additive inverse of that second number. So if I had a subtraction problem like 3 subtract 2, what we would do is that we would change that subtraction to addition. And then because this is a positive 2, the additive inverse would be a negative 2. So from positive to negative, or if it was a negative, it would go from negative to positive. And now, guess what? We have an addition problem, and we know what those addition rules are. So we don't have to concern ourselves with subtraction as long as we're only working with addition rules. So let's do 2 quick little problems to remind ourselves, how does 7th grade positive and negative signs play a part into adding and subtracting decimals? So here, before we start, we have 5 and 2/10, which are negative, and 3 and 84/100, which are negative. So if I have a negative and I'm adding another negative, altogether we know that my solution will be negative. So now that I know what I'm doing, basically I'm adding these together with a negative outcome. I'm going to add a 0 into that spot to hold that place value. 0 plus 4 is 4. 2 plus 8 is 10. We're going to carry that 1, that becomes 9, and that decimal comes down. So we're going to end up with a negative 9 and 400ths. So we can see, again, we're just doing the rules we did before, but we're deciding ahead of time, are we adding these numbers or are we subtracting these numbers? Here I have a subtraction problem. It's 3 and 8/10, and we're subtracting 4 and 25/100. So let's rewrite this subtraction problem into an addition problem. We're going to keep that 3 and 8/10, and this positive 4 and 25/100 becomes a negative 4 and 25/100. Well, we can see we have different signs, which means that we're going to have to take the difference of these two numbers. But we also recognize that if we just look at the whole numbers by themselves, if I look at this 3 and I look at this negative 4, negative 4 is further away from 0 than 3 is. And if that's the case, that means that I have to end up with a negative solution. Knowing that it's going to be negative, I have more negatives than I have positives is another way to think about it. I can then just take the difference of the numbers. And then when I take the difference of numbers, I always want to put absolute value, largest number, on top. Once again, we're going to add a 0 in that spot so that we can keep our number straight. 5 minus 0 is 5. I'm going to have to do some borrowing here. Get a 10 over, so I have 12 take away 8, which is 4, and then 3 take away 3, which is 0. So our answer then becomes negative 45/100. So hopefully that little twist that we're adding, that's really the core of 7th grade, but hopefully the review of adding and subtracting decimals helped you as well.